Every dish the Amish put on the table carries a secret that most Americans have never stopped to ask about. These recipes did not begin in Pennsylvania. They began in the mountain valleys of Switzerland more than 300 years ago. So why does a bowl of Amish bean soup taste like something older than the United States itself? Because it is. Most people think of Amish food as simple farm cooking, honest and plain, maybe a little old-fashioned. That framing is not wrong, but it misses something enormous. What sits on an Amish table is not just food, it is a living archive. Every preserved jar, every slow-braised pot of meat, every loaf of dense rye bread is carrying a memory that stretches back across an ocean. And most Americans walk right past it without knowing what they are looking at. The Amish are one of the most studied communities in North America. And yet the story of where their food actually comes from is almost never told in full. Food historians talk about Pennsylvania Dutch cuisine as though it appeared fully formed on American soil. It did not. It was carried here by people who were fleeing for their lives, and the food they brought with them was shaped by that fear just as much as by any recipe. The stakes here are real, because what the Amish preserved in their kitchens, the rest of the Western world largely forgot. Techniques that died out in European cooking after industrialization survived in Ohio and Indiana and Lancaster County because a small group of people refused to change. That refusal was not stubbornness for its own sake. It was theology made practical, and it shaped every single meal. The one thing this video is really about is how Anabaptist food heritage crossed an ocean intact, and why the Amish kitchen became the place where old world cooking America never managed to erase. That is the thread running through everything that follows. To understand Amish cooking traditions, you have to go back to the early 1500s in the Swiss and German-speaking territories of Europe. The Anabaptist movement was born there, a radical branch of the Protestant Reformation that rejected infant baptism and insisted that church membership had to be a free adult choice. This made them dangerous in the eyes of both Catholic and Protestant authorities. They were hunted, imprisoned, and executed across Switzerland, the Rhine Valley, and what is now southern Germany. Entire communities were forced off their land. They took to the hills, the forests, the remote Alpine valleys, where authorities were slower to reach. And there, in those isolated places, they farmed. They farmed the way people farm when they cannot afford to fail, because failure meant starvation or capture or both. The food culture that developed in those circumstances was built entirely around two ideas: preserve everything and waste nothing. Root cellars were dug deep. Smoking, salting, and fermentation were not optional techniques. They were survival. Sauerkraut was not a side dish. It was a vegetable that could last through a brutal Alpine winter when nothing else could. Bean soups were built thick and dense because dried legumes stored for years and provided protein when meat was scarce. Lard was rendered and kept because fat was calories and calories were life. Every technique that would later define Pennsylvania Dutch cuisine was already in place before a single Anabaptist had ever heard of America. Now the movement fractured, as movements do. In 1693, a bishop named Jacob Amann broke from the main Swiss Anabaptist community in a dispute over church discipline. His followers became the Amish. They were stricter, more separatist, more committed to keeping themselves apart from the surrounding world. That separatist instinct would turn out to be the single most important factor in preserving their food traditions intact across the next 3 centuries. William Penn's policy of religious tolerance in Pennsylvania made the colony a destination for persecuted groups across Europe. The Amish began arriving in significant numbers in the early 1700s, settling first in Lancaster County, then spreading into neighboring regions as land filled up. They arrived with their seeds, their tools, and their methods. They arrived with a cuisine already fully formed by 200 years of hardship and isolation. And in Pennsylvania, something unexpected happened. The land was extraordinarily rich. The limestone soils of Lancaster County were among the most fertile in North America. What had been survival farming in the Swiss hills became abundance farming in Pennsylvania. The same techniques that were designed to stretch scarce resources now produced remarkable surpluses. The bean soups got richer. The smoked meats became a tradition rather than a necessity. The root cellars stayed, but now they were full. And the community table, the long shared meal at the center of Amish social life, grew into something genuinely joyful. So how did these specific techniques survive while the rest of American food culture moved on? The answer has three parts and they build on each other. The first part is deliberate separation. The Ordnung, the set of unwritten community rules that govern Amish life, does not just regulate clothing and technology, it regulates the pace of life itself. When the surrounding culture adopted gas stoves, the Amish kept wood-fired ones. When refrigeration arrived, the Amish kept cold cellars and continued canning. This was not ignorance, it was a conscious choice to stay connected to the practices that bound the community together. Food was not just nutrition, it was a form of membership. The second part is the role of women and intergenerational transmission. Amish girls learned to cook young, and they learned by doing, not by reading. A 12-year-old in an Amish kitchen in Ohio in 1960 was learning techniques that her great-great-grandmother had used in a Swiss valley in 1720. There were no cookbooks mediating that transfer for most of that history. The knowledge lived in hands, not pages. The third part is community cooking at scale. Amish events, barn raisings, church services, weddings, funerals, all of them involve feeding large numbers of people. And that social function kept the old recipes alive in a way that individual family cooking simply cannot. When you have to feed 300 people at a barn raising, you make what works. What works is what your grandmother made and her grandmother before her. Traditional Amish meals in that context are not nostalgic. They are logistical. The specific dishes carry the history directly if you know how to read them. Scrapple is a perfect example. It is a Pennsylvania Dutch staple made from pork scraps and cornmeal, cooked down into a loaf and then sliced and fried. To outsiders, it sounds like poverty food, and in its origins, it was exactly that. The Anabaptist communities in Switzerland had no tradition of wasting any part of a slaughtered animal because they could not afford to. When they arrived in Pennsylvania and encountered cheap, abundant corn, they adapted their old pork scrap traditions to the new ingredient. Scrapple is old world cooking. America cannot fully claim as its own, because it belongs to the crossing. It is a dish that sits exactly on the seam between European origins and American soil. Shoofly pie is another window into the history. Most people assume it is called that because flies were attracted to its molasses sweetness and had to be shooed away. But the real history points to a European molasses-based cake tradition brought by German-speaking settlers that evolved in Pennsylvania kitchens over generations. The name itself is American, but the technique is not. The dense, crumb-topped texture of Shoofly pie connects directly to German streusel traditions going back centuries. Apple butter is another case. Long, slow cooking in massive copper kettles, the entire community gathered to stir, is not an Amish invention. It arrived from the Rhine Valley, where fruit preservation through reduction was a standard household practice. In Pennsylvania, it became a communal ritual, but the chemistry is identical to what Rhine Valley farm families were doing in the 1600s. But how did the Amish manage to hold all of this together as the 20th century pressed in around them? The short answer is that the pressure actually reinforced their commitment rather than breaking it. Every time the outside world moved faster, the Amish moved more deliberately. When industrial food arrived, cheap and convenient and entirely disconnected from the farm, the Amish simply kept farming. Lancaster County Amish farms in the mid-20th century were producing yields that astonished agricultural researchers. Using no synthetic fertilizers and no heavy machinery, they were rotating crops, composting intensively, and practicing animal husbandry in ways that had been refined over 2 centuries on American soil but originated in European necessity. The food that came out of those farms carried that care directly. Milk from Amish dairies in that era had fat and protein levels that commercial operations rarely matched. Heirloom vegetable varieties that had disappeared from mainstream American agriculture were still being grown in Amish kitchen gardens because no one had ever replaced them. Seed saving, which the rest of American farming essentially abandoned in the 20th century, remained standard Amish practice. Some Amish communities today are still growing varieties of beans and squash and corn that connect directly to strains brought from Europe in the 1700s. That is not a small thing. That is a living biological record of Anabaptist food heritage stretching back more than 300 years. The food also carried the theology in ways that are easy to miss if you are not looking. The Amish concept of Gelassenheit, a German word meaning roughly yielding, submission, letting go, shapes the entire culture, and it shapes the food as well. There is no showmanship in Amish cooking. There are no elaborate presentations designed to impress. The meal is abundant because abundance comes from the land, and the land is a gift, not an achievement. Sharing food with the community is not generosity in the sense of sacrifice. It is the expected expression of belonging. A visitor to an Amish home who is not fed has been treated wrongly. That is not hospitality as a social performance, it is hospitality as a theological position. The long shared table, the plain dishes, the quantity over elegance, all of it encodes a specific view of what humans are supposed to be to each other. Old world cooking America brought the techniques, but the Amish kept the meaning attached. The influence of Pennsylvania Dutch cuisine on American food more broadly is real, even if it is under-acknowledged. The American preference for heavily laden picnic tables, the tradition of community-covered dish gatherings, the rural habit of putting up preserves for winter, none of these things emerged from nowhere. They were modeled and practiced by German-speaking immigrant communities for whom these habits were not optional but essential. The Amish simply held on to that world the longest and the most completely. When food writers began rediscovering traditional techniques in the late 20th century, sourdough fermentation, nose-to-tail butchery, cold cellaring, canning, seed saving, they were in many cases rediscovering what Amish kitchens had never stopped doing. The farm-to-table movement arrived in American restaurants around 2000 and was celebrated as revolutionary. In Amish farmhouses in Lancaster County, it had never been anything other than Tuesday. Here is what makes it all click into place. That bowl of Amish bean soup, dense and slow cooked and built from dried legumes and smoked pork and root vegetables, is not a rustic American recipe. It is a Swiss Anabaptist survival dish that was designed in the 1600s for people living in Alpine hiding. Adapted with American ingredients, carried intact across 300 years of deliberate separation from the modern world, and served on a plain wooden table in Ohio or Indiana or Pennsylvania as though nothing remarkable had happened. Amish food history is not really about food. It is about what a small group of people chose to hold on to when everything around them was moving on. They held on to the land. They held on to the methods. They held on to the table as a place where belonging was made real every single day. And because they did, the rest of us still have the chance to taste something that the European world those recipes came from has largely lost. The next time you see a jar of Amish apple butter on a market shelf, you are not looking at a quaint regional product. You are looking at a 300-year-old thread running from the Rhine Valley to Lancaster County unbroken.